The sea was calm the night Joseph finally spoke, the kind of calm that feels rehearsed. As though the world itself were holding its breath, his hands trembled, not from age alone, but from the weight of 80, 3 years spent swallowing words that tasted like iron and salt. In 1912, the ocean had learned his name. The world had not. He remembered the moment his foot touched the deck of the Titanic, how the ship seemed less like a vessel and more like a floating city that did not expect him to belong. White gloves brushed past him, polished shoes turned away, and eyes lingered just long enough to remind him that history had already decided where men like him were supposed to stand. Joseph carried his ticket tightly, as if it might dissolve if he loosened his grip, as if proof of his right to exist in that space could vanish at any second. At night, the ship whispered. Pipes groaned, walls breathed, and the Atlantic pressed itself against steel like a listener desperate for secrets. Joseph could never sleep properly. He walked the corridors instead, learning the hidden rhythms of the ship, sensing that something enormous was coiled beneath the laughter and champagne. The Titanic was too confident, too certain of its own immortality, and Joseph had learned long ago to distrust anything that claimed it could not sink. When the impact came, it was not the scream people imagine. It was a shudder, deep and restrained, like the ship flinching in shame. Joseph felt it in his bones before he heard it, before anyone allowed themselves to believe it was real. Orders were delayed. Doors were closed. Certain people were told to wait. Joseph was one of them. Time stretched, thick and suffocating, as the truth crept in through freezing corridors. He saw things that night that never made it into newspapers. Choices made quickly. Eyes turned away. Silence enforced not with threats, but with indifference. Survival was not distributed equally, it was rationed. When Joseph finally escaped the ship, the ocean did not feel like freedom. It felt like judgment. Afterward, no one asked him what he saw. And when he tried to speak, the world gently, firmly, pushed him back into the margins. History, he learned, prefers its tragedies tidy, and its survivors convenient. So Joseph lived his life quietly, carrying a story that grew heavier with every passing year. Now, with his voice worn thin and his time nearly spent, he understood something he had not grasped in 1912. The Titanic did not only sink into the Atlantic. Parts of it were buried deliberately, along with the people who did not fit the legend. And tonight, at last, Joseph was done sinking with it. Joseph did not board the Titanic as a man fully seen. In 1912, visibility was a dangerous thing for someone like him, and he had learned early that survival often depended on choosing when to disappear. The name on his ticket was close enough to his own to answer to, yet distant enough to feel like armor. It was not forged, but it was borrowed, adjusted, softened so it would not provoke questions from clerks who looked past him rather than at him. Names carried weight in that world, and his real one carried too much of a history he was trying to outrun. He had not always planned to leave. The decision came slowly, layered with disappointment and quiet fear, built from years of being reminded that the future had already been decided by someone else. Every dock he worked, every job he lost without explanation, every door that closed politely but firmly in his face added another reason to go. When word spread of a ship that promised new beginnings, a floating declaration of progress and modernity, Joseph heard something else beneath the advertisements. He heard distance. He heard escape. Buying the ticket required restraint. He kept his eyes low, his voice calm, his movements deliberate. He understood how quickly attention could turn hostile if it lingered too long. The clerk barely looked at him, which felt both like an insult and a mercy. Money changed hands. Papers slid across the counter. Just like that, Joseph possessed passage on the largest ship ever built, even though the world still struggled to imagine him standing on its deck. As the departure day approached, doubt crept in. Not about the ship, but about himself. He wondered if the ocean would be any kinder than the land he was leaving behind, if prejudice could truly be outrun, or if it simply learned to swim. Packing was simple. He owned little and trusted less. The most important thing he carried was the belief that motion itself could be transformative, that crossing an ocean might loosen the grip of the past. When he first saw the Titanic rising above the harbor, it felt unreal, like something built to mock human limits. Its size was overwhelming, its confidence unsettling. People gathered around it with awe, pointing and smiling as if the ship were already victorious over nature. Joseph stood apart, watching the way others claimed it with their excitement, how they spoke of it as theirs before it had even moved. He did not feel ownership, he felt caution. Boarding was a study in contrasts. Families laughed, stewards hurried. Brass instruments gleamed under pale sunlight. Joseph moved through it quietly, aware of how his presence shifted the air around him. Some faces hardened. Others avoided him entirely. No one said anything outright, but he did not need words to understand the boundaries being drawn. He stayed within them, because crossing lines had consequences he could not afford. The borrowed name echoed in his head as he stepped onto the gangway. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling the weight of what he was leaving behind and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. This name was a key, but it was also a reminder that he was entering a world that required him to be less than fully himself. Still, he took the step. The plank did not creak. The sea did not stir. History did not pause to notice. Once aboard, Joseph felt the ship's pulse beneath his feet, a low, steady vibration that suggested purpose and inevitability. He told himself that this was only transportation, not destiny, yet something about the Titanic made promises without speaking. It promised safety, superiority, permanence. Joseph did not believe in promises that sounded too complete. Life had taught him that perfection was often a mask. He found his assigned space and sat for a long time without unpacking. Around him, the ship filled with voices and movement, confidence and anticipation. He listened, absorbing accents and ambitions, sensing how small he was within this enormous narrative already forming. Somewhere in the depths of the vessel, engines waited to wake. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a future waited to be rewritten. Joseph remained still, carrying a past that refused to let go, and a name that was never truly his, knowing that once the ship left the harbor, there would be no easy way back, no simple way to reclaim what he had set aside, and no guarantee that the ocean would allow him to arrive as anything more than a shadow. Drifting forward under a borrowed identity, chasing a version of himself that might not survive the crossing. From the moment the ship eased away from the dock, Joseph felt the invisible lines tighten around him. They were not marked with ropes or signs, but they were there all the same, drawn through glances that lingered too long and silences that fell too fast. The Titanic moved with confidence, yet within its corridors the social order remained rigid, and Joseph sensed that his presence disrupted an unspoken agreement about who belonged where. He walked carefully, not because anyone told him to, but because experience had trained him to recognize danger before it announced itself. Eyes followed him in public spaces, sometimes openly curious, sometimes sharpened by suspicion. In the dining areas, conversations dipped when he passed, as if his proximity thinned the air. No one challenged him directly. Instead, there were smaller gestures, a steward redirecting him down a longer route, a polite smile that did not reach the eyes, a pause before answering his questions that felt like a test. These moments accumulated, subtle but relentless, reminding him that even on a ship celebrated as the pinnacle of progress, old prejudices traveled first class. Joseph learned quickly which corridors felt safer and which ones pressed in on him like narrowing walls. The grand staircases, gleaming with polished wood and confidence, were spaces he crossed sparingly. He felt exposed there, framed by luxury that was never meant to include him. In quieter passageways, near the hum of machinery and the scent of oil, he breathed more easily. The ship had layers, and so did its judgments. He navigated both with caution. At night, when laughter spilled from private rooms and music drifted softly through the decks, the tension did not fade. If anything, it sharpened. Alcohol loosened tongues and stripped away restraint. A remark muttered under someone's breath. A stare held just long enough to feel deliberate. Joseph kept his composure, reminding himself that reacting would only confirm expectations already waiting to be fulfilled. Silence, he knew, was often mistaken for consent, but it was also armor. There were moments of uneasy kindness that confused him more than outright hostility. A steward who spoke gently but never lingered. A fellow passenger who asked where he was from, then quickly lost interest when the answer did not entertain. These interactions carried a quiet warning key. Curiosity had limits, and stepping beyond them invited consequences. Joseph remained within those limits, even as they closed around him. He became acutely aware of how sound traveled differently for him. Footsteps behind him felt louder. Laughter ahead felt exclusionary. Even the ship's constant mechanical breathing seemed to pause when he entered certain spaces, as though the vessel itself were watching. He began to adjust his pace, his posture, his expression, refining himself into something less noticeable. Each adjustment was small, but together they formed a version of him shaped by vigilance rather than freedom. Meals were particularly revealing. Seating arrangements spoke volumes without saying a word. Joseph ate when and where he was told, observing how others took their places without thinking, how comfort looked effortless on them. He noticed how service arrived quicker at some tables, how voices carried authority at others. The hierarchy was invisible to those who benefited from it, and unmistakable to those who did not. Rumors traveled faster than the ship. He heard fragments of conversations that reduced him to speculation, to assumptions built on nothing but his presence. Some spoke as if he were an anomaly, others as if he were a threat, and a few as if he were simply a curiosity to be explained away. No one asked him who he was. They decided instead, and those decisions shaped how doors opened or closed. Joseph found himself counting days not by the calendar, but by endurance. Each sunrise marked another successful negotiation with a world that did not expect him to be there. Each sunset brought relief tempered with exhaustion. He reminded himself why he had boarded, why he had accepted a borrowed name and an uncertain future. Leaving was not just about geography. It was about the hope that distance might dull the sharpest edges of exclusion. Still, the ship refused to let him forget. Every polished surface reflected a version of himself that stood out, impossible to blend in completely. He carried the awareness constantly, like a low ache, knowing that if something went wrong, he would not be given the benefit of doubt or priority. He understood, with growing clarity, that being watched was not the same as being protected, and that on this ship, observation did not equal concern. As the days passed, the tension became familiar, almost routine, yet it never softened. It simply settled deeper, weaving itself into his thoughts and movements. Joseph adapted, because adaptation was what he had always done, but beneath that controlled exterior, a quiet certainty formed. Whatever awaited them ahead, the Titanic was not the equalizer people believed it to be. It was a mirror, reflecting the world exactly as it was, and in that reflection, Joseph saw himself standing alone, visible enough to be noticed, invisible enough to be disregarded, moving forward through narrow spaces carved by other people's comfort, aware that every step he took was being measured against expectations he never agreed to, expectations that followed him like shadows along the endless corridors, refusing to let him forget that even surrounded by thousands, he was traveling under constant scrutiny, watched not for who he was, but for what others feared he might be. The night Joseph overheard the conversation, the ship was wrapped in a deceptive stillness that made every sound feel amplified. The Atlantic lay smooth and dark beyond the portholes, and most passengers had retreated into private comfort, lulled by the steady forward motion of the Titanic. Joseph had taken to walking late, when the corridors emptied and the tension of being watched eased just enough for him to breathe. It was during one of these quiet hours, near a service passage not meant for lingering, that voices drifted toward him, low and deliberate. At first, he meant to keep moving. Eavesdropping was dangerous, and curiosity had never been a luxury he could afford. But something in the tone of the voices stopped him. They were not casual. There was no laughter, no looseness. These were men speaking with purpose, choosing words carefully, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Joseph slowed, then stood still, pressed partially into shadow, his presence absorbed by the hum of machinery and the distant creak of steel. He caught fragments first, references to speed, to schedules that mattered more than caution. One voice carried the calm authority of someone, accustomed to being obeyed. The other edged with unease that suggested doubt rather than ignorance. They spoke of messages received earlier in the day, warnings phrased as inconveniences, dismissed with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Joseph felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. This was not gossip. This was something closer to intention. As the conversation continued, the shape of it sharpened. They spoke of ice as though it were an obstacle, to be managed rather than a threat, of maintaining momentum to satisfy expectations waiting on the other side of the ocean. The ship, they implied, had a reputation to uphold, and slowing down would betray the myth already forming around it. One of them mentioned how unsinkable had become more than a description, how it was now a promise that could not be publicly questioned. The other hesitated, reminding him that steel still answered to nature. The response was quiet, firm, and dismissive. Joseph felt the weight of those words settle into him. He had lived long enough to recognize the sound of risk being justified, of danger reframed as necessity. It was the same language used to excuse countless injustices on land, now repurposed for the open sea. He understood, then, that accidents were often preceded by choices, and choices were often protected by confidence and silence. A soft laugh punctuated the exchange, brief and humorless. It carried the unsettling suggestion that even if something did go wrong, the consequences would not be shared equally. Resources, they implied without saying it outright, would be sufficient. Plans existed. The ship was prepared. The faith placed in its design bordered on reverence. Joseph noticed what was missing from the conversation as much as what was spoken. There was no mention of the people filling the lower spaces, no acknowledgement of how quickly order could fracture when fear replaced ceremony. He should have walked away sooner. He knew that. But his feet remained rooted, his mind racing ahead to possibilities he did not want to imagine. When the voices finally moved on, their footsteps fading into privilege and authority, Joseph stayed where he was, listening to the ship resume its ordinary sounds. The Titanic did not feel the same after that. Its confidence now struck him as brittle, its smooth progress as something forced, rather than natural. For the rest of the night, sleep refused him. He lay awake replaying the conversation, testing it against his instincts, wondering if he was overreaching, misinterpreting, letting fear shape meaning where there was none. Yet the unease would not loosen its grip. He had trusted his instincts his entire life because they had kept him alive. Ignoring them had always come at a cost. The next day, everything appeared unchanged. Passengers strolled the decks, music drifted through the air, and laughter sparkled like sunlight on water. The ship continued at its relentless pace, slicing through the Atlantic with unwavering determination. To everyone else, this was confidence. To Joseph, it felt like denial. He watched faces glow with belief in the ship's invincibility and felt an almost unbearable distance open between what people assumed and what he now suspected. He considered speaking to someone, anyone, but quickly dismissed the idea. Who would listen to him? A man already navigating suspicion simply by existing in these spaces. Even if he tried, his concern would likely be dismissed as misunderstanding or fear. Authority rarely welcomed warnings from the margins. Silence, once again, was enforced not by orders, but by reality. As the hours passed, Joseph found himself observing the ship differently. He noted how officers moved with rehearsed certainty, how decisions flowed downward without question. He watched the horizon. The way night returned with the same quiet confidence as before, and felt a growing certainty that the calm was being actively protected. The conversation had pulled back a curtain, revealing not a conspiracy, but something perhaps more dangerous: belief, untempered by humility. Joseph carried that knowledge alone. It sat heavy in his chest as the ship pressed forward, faster than it needed to, prouder than it should have been. The Titanic was no longer just a marvel to him. It was a declaration, daring the ocean to contradict it, and somewhere deep within the steel and the silence, Joseph sensed that the challenge had already been accepted, that the line between confidence and catastrophe had been crossed quietly, without ceremony, leaving those who would pay the price completely unaware, moving forward beneath chandeliers and stars, trusting a promise that had been made too loudly to be questioned and too carelessly to be kept. When the collision came, Joseph was already awake, his body tuned to the ship's smallest changes. He felt the shift before he heard it, a subtle resistance beneath his feet, as if the Titanic had hesitated mid-thought. There was no dramatic crash, no violent explosion of sound, just a long, unsettling scrape that traveled through the hull like a drawn-out breath. The ship shuddered once, then continued forward, determined to pretend nothing had happened. Around him, confusion flickered but did not ignite. Doors opened. Heads turned. People waited for reassurance that arrived too quickly and too easily. Joseph moved instinctively, not toward the crowd, but away from it. Experience had taught him that clarity rarely lived at the center of commotion. He followed a service passage upward, guided by a tightening in his chest he could not explain. The air felt different, sharper, charged with something unresolved. As he reached an open section of the deck, cold rushed at him, cutting through layers of wool and certainty alike. What he saw there did not match the calm voices echoing through the ship. Crew members stood clustered near the rail, their movements hurried but restrained, as though urgency itself were being rationed. One man leaned over, peering down into the darkness with a focus that bordered on disbelief. Another crossed himself quickly, then glanced around to see if anyone had noticed. Their faces carried a seriousness that no announcement could soften. Joseph followed their gaze and saw it, the ice stretching away into the night, massive and pale, impossibly close. Chunks the size of furniture floated in the water, bumping softly against the hull like debris after an unseen storm. The ocean, moments ago a black mirror, was now alive with fragments, evidence of impact that contradicted every soothing word spoken inside. The Titanic had not merely brushed past danger. It had torn itself open against it. He noticed something else, something that would later trouble him more than the ice itself. A small group of officers stood apart, speaking in low, controlled tones. Their posture was not panicked. It was deliberate. One of them gestured sharply toward the lifeboats, then just as quickly lowered his hand when he realized who might be watching. Another scanned the deck, his eyes moving not in search of damage, but of witnesses. When his gaze passed over Joseph, it paused for a fraction of a second too long. No one addressed Joseph directly. No one explained what was happening. Instead, he was met with a silent assessment, a calculation he had seen before in other places and other crises. He understood then that information was already being filtered, shaped into something manageable before it reached the wider ship. The truth, raw and dangerous, was being contained. Water began to creep along the edges of the deck below, thin and purposeful, glistening under dim lights. Joseph watched it move with an unsettling calm, as though it knew exactly where it was going. Crew members stepped around it carefully, avoiding acknowledgement. One boot slipped, quickly corrected. A glance was exchanged, still no alarm, still the illusion held. Inside, passengers laughed nervously, reassured by confident voices and practiced smiles. Joseph could hear music faintly, stubborn and inappropriate. The contrast was dizzying. On one side of the door, a world desperate to believe in control. On the other, a reality that refused to wait. He felt caught between them, carrying knowledge he was not meant to have. A call rang out, sharp and quickly hushed. Joseph saw a crewman pull another aside, whisper urgently, then straighten as an officer approached. The whisper ended. The posture changed. Authority reasserted itself like a lid snapping shut. Whatever decisions were being made, they were not meant for everyone. They were not meant for him. He realized then that official accounts would be written long before the ship ever sank. They were being formed in these moments, shaped by who spoke and who was expected to listen. Joseph's presence complicated that narrative. He did not belong to the version of events that would later be told, the clean story of bravery and order. He belonged to the margins, where contradictions lived. As the cold intensified and the deck grew slicker, Joseph felt an urge to shout, to point, to force others to look where he was looking. But he knew what that would cost. Panic would not grant him authority. His warning would be weighed against his position and found wanting. Silence pressed in on him, heavy and familiar. The ship listed almost imperceptibly, just enough for those paying attention to feel it in their knees. Joseph was paying attention. He stepped back, his mind racing through exits, possibilities, contingencies. Behind him, a door closed softly, sealing off the view of the ice and the men who stood pretending it was manageable. The sound of that door echoed louder than any alarm could have. In that moment, Joseph understood that what he had witnessed would be denied later, smoothed over into something accidental and unavoidable. He had seen the gap between reality and the story already widening, already being protected. The Titanic was still lit, still moving, still confident, but beneath that confidence lay decisions made in quiet corners. Decisions that chose reputation over urgency and order over truth. Decisions that would leave no room for men like him. When the water rose high enough to demand honesty, leaving him standing in the cold with knowledge that would never be officially acknowledged, watching a disaster begin not with chaos, but with control, with calm voices and careful omissions, with a silence so deliberate it felt louder than the breaking of steel. When the truth finally tore through the calm, it did so unevenly. Orders changed without explanation. corridors filled with hurried footsteps, and the practiced confidence Joseph had watched earlier began to fracture. Still, the fracture did not widen for everyone at once. Some were guided upward with urgency masked as courtesy, while others were told to wait, reassured with smiles that felt rehearsed. Joseph found himself among those stalled by invisible hands, his questions answered with vague gestures and firm instructions to remain where he was. He moved anyway, not boldly, but steadily, following the subtle current of fear that now ran through the ship. As lifeboats were uncovered, the air shifted, thick with disbelief. Joseph reached the deck just as the first boats were being prepared. The sight should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a tightening in his chest. Space was limited. Decisions were being made quickly, and those decisions followed familiar patterns. Women and children were ushered forward. Then men with the right tone of voice, the right clothes, the right assumptions attached to them. Joseph stepped closer, careful not to rush. A hand came up immediately, palm outward, stopping him without contact. The officer did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The look was enough. Not yet. Wait there. Joseph complied, watching as places filled, as ropes were cut and boats lowered into the dark water below. Each descent felt final, a door closing softly but permanently. He tried again at another lifeboat, approaching from a different angle, carrying himself with calm he did not feel. This time, words were exchanged. Brief, polite, dismissive. He was told there was no room, though he could see space with his own eyes. He was told to stand back, to allow order to be maintained. Around him, others protested and pleaded, their voices rising, some heard, some ignored. Joseph did not raise his voice. He knew better. Volume did not equal power here. The cold intensified, creeping through his boots. His resolve tested by every passing minute. The ship's angle grew more pronounced, subtle enough to deny panic, but undeniable to the body. He felt it in his calves, the way he leaned without meaning to. Water was climbing now, not rushing, but advancing with patience that felt cruel. The lifeboats continued to leave, fewer each time, their silhouettes shrinking into the vast blackness. At one point, chaos threatened to erupt, a surge forward, a shout, a weapon drawn briefly, then concealed again. Order reasserted itself through fear rather than fairness. Joseph found himself pressed against a railing, trapped between bodies and steel, acutely aware that survival was being negotiated in moments, not promised to all. He realized then that he was being measured not by urgency, but by expendability. His chance came not through permission, but through confusion. A lifeboat hung half-lowered, its crew distracted by a shouted command from above. Someone stumbled. A gap opened where certainty had been. Joseph moved into it without hesitation, not running, not pushing, simply stepping where no one was looking closely enough to stop him. A hand grabbed his coat. He twisted free, feeling fabric tear. No one called after him. The attention had already shifted elsewhere. The descent was terrifying. The lifeboat lurched as weight redistributed, ropes groaning under strain. Joseph gripped the edge, his knuckles burning with cold and effort. When they hit the water, the impact jarred his bones, sending a shock through his teeth. The Titanic loomed above them, impossibly large, its lights still blazing, its decks still crowded with those who believed there would be time. As they pulled away, the guilt struck harder than the cold. Joseph watched faces blur into distance, heard cries carried across the water, felt the unbearable knowledge that survival had not been earned through virtue or courage, but through timing and invisibility. He had lived because he had slipped through a crack, because he had not been important enough to stop. Hours later, numb and shivering, he was hauled onto another ship, wrapped in blankets that did little to warm what had already begun to harden inside him. Around him, survivors spoke in fragments, clinging to each other, clinging to stories that made sense of what had happened. Joseph said nothing. He understood that his version would not fit. He had seen denial before rescue, selection before salvation, silence before safety. In the days that followed, questions were asked, but not of him. Officials focused on heroes and numbers, on narratives that preserved dignity. When Joseph tried to speak, his words were redirected, his experiences minimized, folded into a larger story that did not need his details. He felt the pressure not as a threat, but as an erasure, gentle and complete. So he learned to carry it alone. The sound of ropes. The look in the officer's eyes. The moment he stepped forward knowing others would not. Survival became something complicated, something stained by the knowledge of who had been left behind and why. The ocean had spared him, but it had also marked him, and as the years passed, that mark grew heavier than any weight he had felt that night. Heavier than the cold, heavier than fear. A burden shaped like memory and silence and the unspoken understanding that living was not the same as being saved. That some escapes cost more than they give, and that the act that kept his heart beating would follow him for the rest of his life. Unresolved, unconfessed, drifting just beneath the surface of every breath he took. Like the dark water he had crossed to survive, the silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as procedure, wrapped in courtesy and official concern. In the days following the rescue, Joseph found himself surrounded by questions that never quite reached him. Investigators moved through survivors with notebooks and solemn expressions, selecting voices that fit neatly into the narrative already forming. When Joseph stood nearby, waiting to be acknowledged, their eyes slid past him as though he were part of the background, another shadow cast by the disaster rather than a witness to it. When he did speak, it was often interrupted, a detail dismissed as confusion, a memory gently corrected. He was thanked for his time before he had finished his sentence. There was no anger in their manner, no overt hostility. That was what made it so effective. The erasure was polite, efficient, and final. His experience did not align with what was needed, so it was quietly set aside. Reporters clustered around survivors who could offer dramatic clarity, stories of heroism framed by familiar faces. Joseph watched from a distance as accounts were shaped, smoothed, and repeated until they hardened into truth. The Titanic became a story of bravery under pressure, of order maintained against impossible odds. There was no space in that story for hesitation, for selective rescue, for decisions made in whispers before panic ever arrived. There was certainly no space for him. He was advised, gently, to rest, to recover, to avoid reliving the trauma unnecessarily. A man with authority and a voice practiced in reassurance suggested that not all memories needed to be shared, that some things were better left to professionals. Joseph understood the message beneath the concern. Speaking would not help him. It would only complicate matters for those already deciding what the world would remember. Even among other survivors, he felt the distance grow. Shared tragedy did not always create shared understanding. Some avoided him, uncomfortable with reminders that did not match their own experiences. Others offered sympathy that felt conditional, as though his presence unsettled the fragile coherence of their survival. He learned quickly that silence made people more comfortable, and comfort, he realized, was valued far more than truth. When official accounts were published, Joseph searched for himself without really expecting to be found. Names appeared. Categories formed. Numbers replaced faces. He existed only as part of a statistic, stripped of context, his individuality dissolved into totals and footnotes. The absence stung more than any misrepresentation could have. It confirmed what he had already sensed. He had survived the sinking, but not the story. Returning to ordinary life proved more difficult than he had imagined. The world had moved on, eager to memorialize the Titanic as a tragedy safely contained in the past. Joseph carried it with him instead, every detail sharp and unyielding. He noticed how people leaned forward when he mentioned the ship, their interest quick and shallow, how it faded the moment his version threatened the familiar myth. Eventually, he stopped mentioning it at all. Years passed. The silence settled into routine. Joseph built a life around what could be said and what could not. He learned how to redirect conversations, how to swallow memories before they reached his tongue. At night, the ship returned to him in fragments. The angle of the deck, the sound of water moving where it should not have been, the look exchanged between men who understood the cost of honesty. He woke often with his heart racing, his mouth full of words he could not release. The world celebrated anniversaries. Books were written, films imagined moments Joseph knew had unfolded very differently. Each retelling felt like a quiet theft, not only of accuracy, but of acknowledgement. He was not angry so much as exhausted. Fighting a story that powerful required energy he did not have, and the consequences of being dismissed repeatedly had taught him caution. Silence, once enforced, became self-sustaining. There were moments when he considered breaking it. A letter half written, then burned. A conversation begun, then abandoned. Each time, the same calculation surfaced. Who would listen now, after so many years, after the narrative had calcified into legend? His truth would sound disruptive, inconvenient, perhaps even unbelievable. The risk felt heavier than the relief. So Joseph aged with the secret intact. His body slowed, his voice softened, but the memory remained sharp, untouched by time. He watched as the Titanic transformed from recent disaster to distant history, from history to symbol. The farther it drifted from living memory, the safer the official version became. Silence, he realized, was not just imposed in the aftermath. It was maintained by repetition, by comfort, by the collective decision not to look too closely. By the time decades had passed, the absence of his voice felt intentional, even strategic. He had not been forgotten by accident. He had been excluded because inclusion would require reckoning. And reckoning, he understood, was something the world rarely pursued unless forced. Joseph lived quietly, carrying a truth that pressed against him with increasing urgency as the years narrowed ahead. The silence that had once protected him now felt like a debt unpaid. Each unspoken detail weighed more heavily than the last, until the question was no longer whether the world was ready to hear him, but whether he could afford to leave it without ever having spoken. Knowing that history had taken his survival but denied his voice, folded his existence into absence, and moved forward as though the silence itself were proof that nothing more needed to be said. As the years stretched into decades, the silence Joseph carried did not fade into the background of his life as he once hoped it might. Instead, it aged with him, growing heavier as his body weakened, as if memory itself refused to loosen its grip. Time softened many things, but not the night of the sinking, and not the knowledge of what had been deliberately left out. The world remembered the Titanic with polished reverence, but Joseph remembered it with raw edges that never dulled. He tried, at first, to build distance between himself and the past. Work, routine, and ordinary obligations filled his days, offering structure that kept the memories at bay. Yet even in moments of calm, the Atlantic returned uninvited. A sudden cold wind could bring back the bite of that night. The sound of water sloshing against a pier could summon the slow, deliberate way the ocean climbed steel corridors. His body reacted before his mind could intervene, muscles tightening, breath shortening, as if disaster were always only moments away. Guilt settled into him quietly. It was not the loud, dramatic guilt people spoke of, but something persistent and corrosive. He replayed the moment he stepped into the lifeboat again and again, each time seeing different faces in the crowd he left behind. Some were clear, others blurred, but all carried the same unspoken question. Why you? He knew the answer was not bravery or worthiness. It was circumstance. It was invisibility. That truth gnawed at him, making survival feel less like a victory and more like an unresolved moral debt. Fear accompanied the guilt, though it changed shape over time. In the early years, it was fear of speaking and being dismissed, of being ridiculed or accused of exaggeration. Later it became fear of being believed too late, of reopening wounds that others preferred sealed. He watched how quickly societies defended their legends, how aggressively. They protected comforting narratives. Challenging them required a resilience he was not always sure he possessed. The unanswered questions haunted him most in quiet moments. He wondered how many lives might have been saved if warnings had been taken seriously, if urgency had replaced arrogance. He questioned whether the outcome had truly been unavoidable or merely accepted. These thoughts circled endlessly, offering no resolution, only the steady ache of what could never be changed. He had no one with whom he could share these questions honestly. The few times he hinted at them, conversations ended awkwardly, eyes shifting away as if proximity to doubt were contagious. As the Titanic became myth, Joseph felt increasingly detached from the way it was discussed. He attended memorials once or twice, standing at the edges, listening to speeches that praised courage and order. The words felt rehearsed, comforting, incomplete. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He stood quietly, aware that his presence alone contradicted the simplicity of what was being said. The ship they remembered was not the one he had known. Age brought reflection whether he wanted it or not. With each passing year, the possibility of speaking diminished in one way and intensified in another. His body grew frail, his energy limited, but his sense of urgency sharpened. He began to consider what would remain after he was gone. The idea that the truth might die with him unsettled him more than the prospect of death itself. Silence, once a shield, now felt like complicity. He started writing privately, not for publication, but for himself. Words spilled out unevenly, sometimes angry, sometimes restrained. He recorded details he feared might fade, anchoring memory to paper in an attempt to preserve what the world had ignored. These pages became a quiet companion, evidence that his experience had existed even if it had never been acknowledged. Still, he kept them hidden, unsure whether revealing them would do more harm than good. The weight of living with unfinished truth shaped his relationships. He remained guarded, selective with trust, careful not to invite questions he could not answer. People described him as reserved, unaware that his restraint was deliberate, cultivated through years of self-protection. They did not see the constant negotiation between memory and silence, playing out behind his measured responses. As the 83rd year since the sinking approached, Joseph felt a shift he could not fully explain. Time no longer felt abundant. The future narrowed, and with it came clarity. The fear that had once kept him quiet lost some of its power, replaced by a deeper fear of leaving things unresolved. He realized that truth did not need permission to exist. It only needed a voice willing to carry it, even briefly. The guilt, the fear, the unanswered questions converged into something like resolve. He could not undo what had happened, but he could refuse to let it remain entirely unspoken. The world might not welcome his account, but that was no longer the point. What mattered was breaking the pattern that had silenced him for so long. Joseph understood that speaking would not bring peace, nor absolution. It would not restore those lost or correct every falsehood, but it would mark the end of his disappearance. After decades of carrying the Titanic alone, he felt ready to set it down, not gently, not cleanly, but honestly, aware that truth, once released, could no longer be controlled, only endured, and that whatever followed would be preferable to letting the weight of memory sink with him into permanent silence. Joseph chose the moment carefully. Though there was nothing dramatic about it, no audience gathered, no announcement made. It began quietly, with a recorder placed on a table and his hands resting beside it, thin and veined, steady despite everything they carried. The room was ordinary, almost painfully so, and that felt right. The truth did not need ceremony, it needed air. 83 years had passed since the Atlantic closed over the Titanic, but when Joseph opened his mouth, the distance collapsed. His voice emerged slowly at first, as if testing whether it was still allowed to exist. He did not begin with the ship or the ice. He began with himself, with the knowledge that history had learned to speak without him, that the silence surrounding his survival had become so complete it felt intentional. Saying that aloud shifted something inside him. The fear that had once tightened his chest loosened, just enough to let the words through. He spoke of boarding under a borrowed name, of learning the ship by its shadows rather than its splendor. He described the way confidence moved through its corridors like a religion, unquestioned and absolute. When he reached the night of the collision, his voice wavered, not from uncertainty, but from the effort of holding the memory in shape. He recounted the ice, the calm voices, the controlled urgency that never reached the people who needed it most. He spoke of lifeboats and glances, and the way decisions formed silently before panic gave anyone permission to notice them. There were moments when he stopped, breath shallow, eyes fixed on a place far beyond the walls of the room. Each pause felt heavy, but it no longer felt dangerous. For the first time, silence was his choice, not his obligation. When he continued, the words came more freely, sharpened by age rather than dulled by it. He did not soften his account. He did not polish it into something easier to accept. He spoke as he remembered, aware that discomfort was not a flaw but a consequence. Joseph understood what this might cost. He knew there would be skepticism, dismissal, perhaps even anger. Challenging a legend meant unsettling those who had built comfort around it. But the fear of reaction no longer outweighed the necessity of speaking. He was not trying to rewrite history alone. He was trying to insert himself back into it, to reclaim the part of the story that had been taken without his consent. As he spoke, he felt something unfamiliar move through him, not relief exactly, but alignment. His voice and his memory were no longer at odds. The decades of carrying a truth no one asked for had distorted his sense of self, folding him inward. Now, even as his body tired, his presence felt expansive. He was no longer speaking to be believed. He was speaking because the truth had endured long enough. He did not frame himself as a hero. He resisted that instinct deliberately. Survival, he said, was uneven, shaped by forces that had nothing to do with virtue. He acknowledged his guilt without dramatizing it, his fear without apologizing for it. He named the silences that followed the rescue, the polite erasures, the way his absence had made the official story easier to tell. Each admission felt like a door closing behind him, sealing off a past defined by restraint. When the recorder finally stopped, Joseph sat quietly, listening to the ordinary sounds of the room return. Nothing around him had changed, and yet everything felt different. The truth was no longer contained entirely within him. It existed now outside his body, vulnerable and uncontrollable, but real. He knew he might not live long enough to see what would come of it, whether it would be challenged, ignored, or slowly absorbed into the larger understanding of what happened that night. That uncertainty no longer frightened him. He had spent a lifetime living with uncertainty imposed from the outside. This was different. This was uncertainty chosen. Whatever response followed, the silence had been broken, and that alone felt like a form of justice. Joseph understood that his words would not dismantle the Titanic's myth overnight. Legends erode slowly, but cracks mattered. Even small ones let light in. He had added his voice to the record not to dominate it, but to complicate it. To remind the world that history was not singular, that survival did not guarantee inclusion, and that silence often said more about power than about truth. As he rested afterward, exhaustion settled into his bones. But beneath it was a steadiness he had not known before. He had carried the weight for as long as he was meant to. Now it belonged to the world. Whether it listened or not was no longer his burden. He had spoken while he still could, on his own terms, refusing to let his life end as a footnote or an omission, choosing instead to stand, at last, in the open space between memory and history, leaving behind a voice where there had only been absence, trusting that even if the waves of doubt rose again, the truth would remain afloat, persistent, undeniable, and finally free from the silence that had kept it submerged for 83 years. Years later, long after Joseph's voice had faded from the world, the recording surfaced in fragments, passed hand to hand, questioned, argued over, and quietly studied by those willing to listen past the legend. Some dismissed it as too late, too inconvenient. Others heard in it something they had never noticed before, the sound of history breathing where it had once been sealed shut. The Titanic did not change, but the way it was remembered did, subtly at first. Like a shift in the tide, no one sees until the shoreline looks different. Joseph did not live to witness the debates or the footnotes that finally bore his name. He did not hear the pauses scholars took when retelling the story, or the hesitation that crept into voices once so certain. What he left behind was not vindication, but disruption. A reminder that truth does not always arrive on time, and that when it does, it rarely asks for permission. In death, as in life, Joseph remained what he had always been, present where he was never expected to be. His testimony unsettled the clean edges of the myth, introducing discomfort where comfort had long reigned. It forced questions that could not be answered without acknowledging who had been heard and who had been ignored. The ship, once described as unsinkable, now carried another quiet flaw in its story. A crack formed not by ice, but by memory finally allowed to surface. The ocean kept its secrets, but Joseph did not. Somewhere between the wreck resting in darkness and the words now circulating above it, a balance shifted. Survival was no longer only about who lived and who died. It was about who was allowed to speak afterward. And in that reckoning, Joseph endured. The Titanic continued to exist as a symbol, but no longer a singular one. It became layered, complicated by voices once pushed aside. In that complexity, Joseph found what had eluded him in life. Not recognition in the spotlight, but acknowledgement in the record. He was no longer a shadow moving through someone else's history. He was part of it. And so the story ended not with the sinking of a ship, but with the rising of a voice that refused to stay buried, proving that even after 83 years of silence, truth still knows how to float.